Verhältnis, wo Grausames geschehen.
Hello and welcome out there in the world. Welcome to our symposium or webinar, or however you want to call it, with a wonderful title, From the Word into the World Wide Web, on Arnold Schoenberg's Moses und Aron. We started with a musical number from Kurt Weill's Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni, with three wonderful singers of our house, the Komische Oper Berlin, Alma Sadeh as Jenny, Ivan Turzic as Fatty, and Kammersänger Jens Larsen as Dreieinigkeits-Moses, accompanied by co-repetitor Christoph Breidler on the piano. Due to Corona, without chorus and orchestra as it should be, which we of course would have assembled here in the foyer of the Komische Oper behind me, but we assembled for wonderful panelists. With us is musicologist Gundula Kreuzer from Yale University. Welcome, Gundula. She specialized in, among many others, many other themes, history and theory of opera, with a special focus on staging, technology, and mediality, contemporary independent opera, screen media, media archaeology, music and politics, music in the Third Reich, and German and European cultural history since 1800. And also with us is musicologist Mary Ann Smart from University of California in Berkeley. Welcome, Mary Ann. Her interests include 19th century opera, staging of opera, singers, music, and gender, as well as performance studies, specifically the interpretation of movement and gesture in contemporary stagings of 19th century opera, among many others. And hello to the world famous conductor Vladimir Jurowski, former music director of Glyndebourne Festival Opera, principal conductor of the London Philharmonic Orchestra, chief conductor of the Berlin Radio Symphony Orchestra, and designated Generalmusikdirektor of the Bavarian State Opera in Munich. In 2015, he was conductor and artistic partner of director Barrie Kosky in the production of Moses and Aron. Welcome, Vladimir. And last but not least, as a kind of co-moderator, my brother in mind, we haven't figured out who is Moses and Aron from us, the wonderful David Levine from University of Chicago, where he is professor in the Department of Germanic Studies, the Department of Cinema and Media Studies, and the Committee of Theater and Performance Studies. He's also chair of the Committee on Theater and Performance Studies. His recent work focuses on the aesthetics and politics of performance in opera, theater, and cinema, but he has also worked extensively as a dramaturg for various opera and ballet productions in Germany and the United States. So he is Moses and Aron, the man of theory and practice in one person. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Ulrich. And I have the honor of introducing Ulrich, who studied musicology, theater, and art history in Munich, Berlin, and Milan. While he was in Italy, he also served as a cultural correspondent for the German newspaper Die Welt and began working in the theater in 1997, first as an assistant at the renowned Staatsoper Stuttgart, and then in the years following as a dramaturg in Linz and Mannheim. In 2006, indeed for 5 years, from 2006 to 2011, he served as the chief dramaturg at the Staatsoper Hannover. And since 2012-13, he's been the chief dramaturg at the Komische Oper in the team that Barrie Kosky put together in Berlin. Ulrich, it's a delight. I know this audience requires no introduction to Ulrich Lenz, but nonetheless. And thanks so much to you and the Komische Oper for bringing us together to discuss this super interesting production.
You're very welcome. Thank you, David. Later on, we will open the discussion to our audience. You can then raise your digital hand, or you can use the chat function of Zoom. You can also use it already now. Please feel free to do so, to add your questions and your remarks. We try to insert your remarks and questions in our talk. Use this chat from Zoom also during our discussion. David, let's start. We started with a number from Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni by Kurt Weill. Why did we decide to do so?
Well, look, I'm happy to give that a shot, but my thought is that really Maestro Jurowski would probably have much more interesting things to say about the relationship between Weill and Schoenberg. Of course, Schoenberg, so let me give it a shot. Look, these are pieces that were written at the same time, and they are both revolutionary works for the history of 20th century opera. So they, I think, in very different ways, Weill's and Brecht's piece much more playfully, Schoenberg's much more seriously, but both come at, it seems to me, the project of opera and seek to fundamentally rethink it and fundamentally revolutionize it. And it seems to me at the same time, and maybe this is less obvious, Schoenberg, there is a history of theatrical play in Schoenberg that I think is also a bridge to Weill, and furthermore, Weill's writing is fundamentally engaged with the history of not just song composition and suffused with the history of opera composition, but fundamentally indebted to Bach. And the dialogue between Weill and Bach and Schoenberg and Bach strikes me as one way to think about the relationship between these two composers working in the early 1930s. That would be my suggestion, but my guess is that my musicologist colleagues and my conductor colleague on this conversation might have much more interesting things to observe.
Maybe Vladimir, you would start. I remember that during the rehearsals of Moses and Aaron, you constantly called the cast's attention to the influence of other composers' work on Moses and Aaron. Weill and Bach were among them, but many other also. And we always said, or we always remarked that the biblical connection between now Mahagoni and Moses and Aaron is obvious, and we are sure that Schoenberg listened to the music of Weill when he was in Berlin, when he composed parts of Moses and Aaron.
Yes, and not only to the music by Weill. We know that Schoenberg was extremely well informed about the music of his contemporaries. He decided to disagree with most of them, though not with all. Obviously, he was mainly faithful to this little group he created, the Second Viennese School. So his pupils were the one he felt indebted to, and they were also his main inspiration. At the same time, there is absolutely no doubt for me that there is a cross-influence between Schoenberg and Hindemith. There is a cross-influence between Schoenberg and Stravinsky, who hated one another. Only as two geniuses can hate one another. And I think they both decided what to learn from the counterpart and what not to learn. Though Schoenberg was in a slightly less favorable situation simply because he died earlier than Stravinsky. After he was gone, Stravinsky felt free to follow into his footsteps without feeling any danger of being in competition. I think that the main thing here is the end of the Romantic era, which was announced by Wagner in Tristan, and I would say which was completed by Richard Strauss in Elektra, led the European, predominantly German music school into some kind of a cul-de-sac. And they were all feeling slightly at a loss there. If you remember the early compositions of Schoenberg, who was still trying to compose like Wagner, following into the footsteps of also his slightly older colleagues such as Richard Strauss and Gustav Mahler, eventually came to the conclusion that none of that worked. And so it was his deliberate decision, and we know that in later years, Schoenberg also specifically said that the 12-tone solution was not the only possible solution. It was among the many solutions there have been at the table at the time, but he decided to pursue that route. At the same time, Stravinsky pursued the opposite route, and then there were people who were sort of in the middle of the road, such as Hindemith, there was Zemlinsky, there was Schreker, but collectively they managed to put a huge, big, fat cross over the coffin of the 19th century opera. Recently, Barrie, Kosky and I, we had a conversation about opera in general, and we came to talk about Moses, and I said, don't you think it is symptomatic that the last great Italian opera, Turandot, remained unfinished, and the last great German opera remained unfinished, and that's Moses and Aron. So in a way, I think in both cases, in case of Turandot and in case of Moses and Aron, the reason for not being able to finish the piece was not the early death, untimely death of the composer, it was the impossibility to go on from there. And in that sense, Schoenberg's Moses and Aron is one of the first postmodernist, if you like, non-operas. And in that sense, Weil, who was much less of an intellectual than Schoenberg, I think he sensed it straight away from the start, because all of his operas are non-operas. And the later he goes with pieces like Mahagoni or Seven Deadly Sins, the further away he gets from the operatic paradigm of the 19th century, and maybe the closer he comes back to the Protestant paradigm of Bach's cantata. And I see a lot of similarities there, but I think the general interest of that time is that no one knew which way to go. They were all collectively searching. And the only difference is that some people were doing it with an extreme instinct, people like Berg or Kurt Weill, and other people who had less of an instinct but more of an intellect. They were trying to intellectualize their way and find it logically. And Schoenberg is an example of an illogical attempt to reach this state of transition from 19th century opera into au-delà. But we know he wasn't able to complete it. He took the piece with him into the exile and never came any further than the sketches of the libretto.
So one would say that if you said, as you said, Vladimir, Arnold Schoenberg is the intellectual way of exploring the new way to the new music, or the way to the path to the new music. So one would say that Schoenberg is maybe a little bit Moses himself, and the other composers are like Aron. So Weil would be more the Aron, because Moses and Aron has the reputation of being a dry and undramatic piece full of theoretical reflection and lacking in theatrical action or suspense. The opposite to Weil's Mahagoni, which is an opera full of theatrical scenes and inventions. So originally Moses and Aron was planned as an oratory, which was Mahagoni was an opera coming from a kind of song spiel. So this mixture. So the question to all: do you think Schoenberg's transformation of the piece into an opera was successful, or is there still something missing? Is it understandable that it's so difficult for many people to connect with this piece? Yes, Marianne?
I find it convincing as an opera, and my experience of it right now over the last couple of weeks, conditioned by all sorts of things, many of which I wouldn't even be able to identify probably, but it's, I've been experiencing it in a very sort of direct and immediate way. So that when I saw your question the other day about, is this really an opera or an oratorio? And then reflecting again on some of the things that Vladimir said just now, I'm actually finding that frame slightly surprising, because there's so much vitality in the music. And it's, I think, partly to do with experiencing it now through the Barrie Kosky production as well. There's so much vitality in the staging. And this is clearly a choice. It's not inherent in the material, and it's not set up in the libretto the way Schoenberg laid it out. Many productions approach the chorus in a much more static way, with less movement, less differentiation among the individuals. The Komische Oper production that we're thinking about right now is very human and very down to earth in contrast with other realizations. So maybe it's partly that makes me convinced about it as an opera. In terms of style and the kind of long narrative of 20th century opera and, putting a period on the 19th century style, I wanted to just jump on the connection with Stravinsky again, because that is the thing that you're never supposed to say in connection with Schoenberg. And I have a feeling that I'll be saying a number of things that Schoenberg would not have liked today. But listening and watching this production, I really kept hearing and thinking about Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring mainly because of the subject matter. But there's quite a big time lag between those two works, and definitely no direct influence or no intentional influence. But there's an interesting tension or conflict between the depictions of the populace in the two works. And then the final thing I would say about sort of style and legacy there is that, and this is sort of why I wanted to jump in right away, I think, that opposition between Schoenberg as Moses and Weill as Aron is a narrative that we see in history, whether or not it's in terms of those two mythical biblical figures or not. That's the standard view of Schoenberg. But when I listen to Moses and Aron, I hear Schoenberg much more concrete and much more disorganized than he probably intended to be. So the process and the starting point is purity. And it's an idea, it's a single tone row that's going to generate an entire evening long work. But the reality is that is not what you perceive. What you perceive is timbre, play of timbres, and incredible orchestration, which brings it much more over into the camp of Stravinsky and sort of surface impressions and sensory input.
I completely agree. And if I can add something on the context in the 1920s. So yes, the end of Romantic opera, but the 1920s, especially in Germany, was a time when composers were looking for a new way of opera. And there was the economic crisis at the beginning of the Weimar Republic after the First World War. And there were numerous calls, once again, that opera was dead. Opernkrise was the slogan of the day. And so all these composers starting off writing operas in the later 1920s, mid to later 1920s, are trying to do something new. And so I think Vladimir Jurowski, your mention of Hindemith is also very resonant here, because like Weill, he's trying to do something radically new with these short operas that engage contemporary technologies, contemporary issues, Neues vom Tage, for example. And so then there's another shift around the late 1920s, early 1930s, when that experimental time kind of comes to an end with the new economic crisis. And now composers begin to look at grander forms. And I see Moses and Aron as being part of that, looking for where can opera go next after this short experimental phase of short, critically engaged Zeitopern, contemporary operas. And so in that sense, I see a parallel here between Krenek, Charles V, Karl V, but also Hindemith, Mathis der Maler, which he starts conceiving in 1932, and then starts writing the libretto in 1933, which is also a very philosophical work, even though it has some more operatic elements like a love interest, a love story, even though that is refuted. Here we don't even have one in Schoenberg. In Hindemith, it is refuted. But so I think it's part of that context where composers ask themselves, how can we make opera on a larger scale again, not these short experimental works of the earlier 20s. And so in that regard, the oratorio comparison, I think also to me doesn't quite fit the bill. On the one hand, there were lots of experiments in the 20s with staging oratorios. There was the huge Handel Renaissance. And so Handel was another composer very much seen to be a novelty because his operas had been forgotten. And a lot was experimented with in terms of modern staging. And in the score of Moses and Aron, I think we can see this increasing interest of Schoenberg in a staged reality, where the stage directions are quite sparse at the beginning and then become very explicit in terms of all the magic of the choir, how they move, how the chorus moves, how he even imagines camels and animals on stage. So that's grand opera on the visual level that comes in here, that comes to play in the opera. And also by contrast to oratorio, the word is foregrounded and yet it is not clearly audible, except for in the Sprechgesang of Moses and in the Sprechgesang portions of the chorus. Because in many parts of the choruses, they're at odds with one another and they have different texts. So we can't, as listeners, we can't actually understand the text. We can't understand much of the philosophical discourse that is going on. So the discourse is actually enacted physically on stage. And I think I agree with you, Marianne, that this discourse is very gripping in the Barrie Kosky production.
I think this would be a good moment to show a short part of the production. I have to apologize in advance for the bad quality. It's not our fault, but Zoom is not made for transmission, for broadcasting music and movies in high definition quality. So just to give a glance of what this production is and what the streaming of this production is, which you still can watch on the website of the Komische Oper Berlin, a brief moment of the people of Israel from the production Moses and Aron, directed by Barrie Kosky. Just a brief moment, but I think it shows that it is anything else than non-theatrical. I mean, it's the production Barrie Kosky put on stage here in the Komische Oper Berlin, and it's a challenge to put it on like this, but it's possible, and I think it's not against what Schoenberg intended. Or do you think this is too much of scenic action? I don't think so. David.
So I had a couple of things I wanted to note here. I think the physicality that Marianne Smart was discussing seems really palpable here, right? That is, these bodies that are in confrontation with one another seem like bodies that are familiar to us, right? I mean, this chorus is not the chorus of many other productions, as Marianne, I think, mentioned, sort of anonymous, distant, and cerebral, but these are corporeal bodies. These are bodies in confrontation and conflict. Well, I think I want to push back, I think very much in the spirit of what Vladimir Jurowski was saying. I want to push back on the notion that somehow Schoenberg is only Moses. I mean, I think my sense is Schoenberg is both Moses and Aron. I mean, he was absolutely a man of the theater. And even if, let's recall, Erwartung is, I think, a very successful piece of the theater. And I think his background in the theater was one that I think is also reflected in this piece. So I guess I would want to say in this scene, we get, I think, a sense, thanks also to the setting of Klaus Grünberg, which I find enormously suggestive. We find, on the one hand, in the costuming, a sense of relevance and access. And in the sense of space, I think I feel myself to be completely disoriented. Like, what space is this? I mean, it's a claustrophobic space. It seems like maybe a kind of apocalyptic hangar or gate at an airport where, you know, it's like a transit zone, but it's not a specific and recognizable space. So we have these bodies that are entirely familiar to us in a space that seems utterly strange. And I think that tension, like the tension between Moses and Aron, a tension between what is accessible and what is fundamentally strange, the interaction and the energy generated by the tension between those strikes me as an enormously interesting and generative tension for this production. I mean, I think that's one of the most exciting things about what this production does.
Yes, Gundula?
Yeah, and I think in terms of genres, I totally agree with you, David, that Schoenberg is a man of the theater, and both Moses and Aron. I think another genre that we might add here to the context is the rise of film, and in particular in the late 20s, the rise of sound film, with which Schoenberg was engaged. And in my viewing, the production actually captures that. So the space is undefined, and especially in the online version, where we are not at the Komische Oper, we're seeing a black screen at the beginning. We don't even know that we are in a theater, except through the accidental coughing of audience members. So that's another very interesting aspect of that we might discuss. But this uniform space, I actually see an allusion to cinemas, and in the ceiling, I see an allusion to film reels. And then of course later, and the whole thing is like a widescreen stage, like in the format. And then of course later, we'll have a clip about that as well. Aron produces the magic with a film camera. And so there's a link in the production, which I think is brilliant to capture this idea of the theatrical, the magical, the illusional as filmic, but within the genre of opera.
Yes, and Barrie added, yes, Marianne, Barrie added the person of Fritz Lang also. There's a little boy with a mask of Fritz Lang. So this is this connects the whole story to the director Fritz Lang in exile. Also, Schoenberg was in exile, and he was, astonishingly, he was in California in exile, where Hollywood was nearby. So writing an opera, or being in the middle of writing an opera about pictures and images and how to use images and how images spoil the pure theory, he was close to the fabric of the factory of dreams in Hollywood, where moving images were invented mostly by Jewish filmmakers. So this all connects to each other. And he dies in the desert of California, far away from his German home, but close to Hollywood and filmmaking in Hollywood. We can see that later on. But Marianne, you wanted to add something.
A couple of things. The main one being, I think, a question to all the rest of you. Interesting to think about Hollywood as a desert. I guess it would have been a desert if they hadn't diverted water from, you know, slightly less Western states into Los Angeles. It's really more of an oasis now, or sort of artificially created oasis, which might be just as good of a metaphor. But and I should stress that that's not the part of California from which I'm talking to you. But I was leafing through the program book earlier today, noticed that on the question of the setting and the idea of a sort of a sound stage or an undifferentiated, mysterious space, I think we'd all agree on the claustrophobia of the space, and also the kind of wonderful energy and tension that's created by the chorus pushing forward against the front of the stage towards the audience quite often. But in the program book, I noticed that Barrie Kosky describes the space as a waiting room. And I think there's a couple of other more concrete explanations given for this space. I found that really illuminating. Train platform is something I had been thinking about because of the whole frequent allusions to transport and deportation, really. My question has to do, and so my mind then went from there to Sartre and no exit, claustrophobia and people cooped up in a sort of waiting room type space. And my question has to do with whether there's, and what the linkages are, if there are any, between a Sartrean notion of a claustrophobic waiting, which is also a kind of Holocaust, which is freighted with the knowledge of the Holocaust, and the more playful references to Beckett in the intertitles at the beginning of each act, and then finally, in another move, to Fritz Lang and Hollywood and the film dimension. Are these three separate filters or three separate elements that come into play in this production, or can they be stitched together in a sort of into some sort of coherence? And Ulrich, you probably have the answer to that, but I'm imagining that everyone has an answer or some suggestions about these things.
Yes, I would say it's a mixture of images, and they're connected to each other, but there is no logic connection. That's how Barrie Kosky works with a lot of images. He mixes together, and they relate to each other. And the one image to the other makes a new view on the well-known, or apparently, or you think you know the picture and the image, but the other image then gives a new touch to the old picture. So the mixture makes it, and I think especially in this production, he mixed a lot of pictures, a lot of images, different images, personalities on stage, and just to give somehow, I think, a panopticon of the whole book of images of Jewish life, I would say. So all there's Theodor Herzl, there's Sigmund Freud, there is Fritz Lang. There we can see it right now within a minute. There are a lot of quotes from movies from the early years of movie, which we don't know anymore. We know, or we know it somehow. We have seen some pictures, but haven't seen the movie. For example, from the early years, from 1915 to 1925 or something like that. So that's all mixed together, I think, to give to open a space to associations of a different kind. So I wouldn't just argue logically to put them together. This means that, it comes out of that. That's all together and give you thoughts about different perspectives of this piece. David?
I wanted to make one comment and ask one question. The comment is to just remind us that, of course, you know, the film industry by no means was either, you know, an invention or the property of Hollywood. The German film industry was enormously important, and enormously important to the Opernkrise, to the period in the teens and 20s that Gundula was reminding us of. That is, there was a great deal of anxiety in the theater, in literature, but also in opera, about, you know, the loss of an audience in the face of the appeal, the Aronesque appeal of the cinema, which was attracting audiences. And certainly the moment at which this piece is written is a moment at which the Germans, and Fritz Lang's erstwhile, at that time, still his wife, Thea von Harbu, who became an enormously important writer for the Nazi cinema, which was an enormously generative and creative cinema. You know, the fears, but also the creativity in German cinema, I think, is in dialogue with the work and certainly the period of the work that we're describing here. Okay, that having been said, and I hope that wasn't too professorial, I wanted to ask, given what I think was a really interesting and very perceptive point about the aesthetics of Barrie Kosky's production, which is associative and generative in part by virtue of the associations not being overdetermined, but being suggestive. I was wondering about the implications of that for Vladimir Jurowski's work with the orchestra, and, you know, whether there is a sense that citationality, which he mentioned earlier, is in some way generative for the creation of the musical soundscape of this piece, of either your work generally or your work specifically in this piece.
Well, first of all, thank you for this question, because this is what I wanted to have suggested to Ulrich in the first place, but unfortunately there is no footage. I think for our viewers and listeners, one of the most interesting experiences would have been seeing both of us, Barrie and myself, at work on this piece, but unfortunately nothing was ever filmed. Because if you see this process, if you see even 2 minutes of how we work together, a lot of your questions would be answered, but more new questions would be generated because we are feeding off each other's ideas. It's a permanent table tennis match. We've done 4 productions together with Barrie and working on the 5th one. Now I think I can say with a certain amount of authority on this that Barrie's productions always follow the same logic. It's the logic of a dream. Things which seem impossible in real life are possible in the dream. The only question which I'm always asking Barrie, and I'm always getting an elusive answer, sometimes no answer at all. Who is dreaming whose dream right now? It was particularly important in our work on The Fiery Angel by Prokofiev, which happened the same year as Moses and Aron, because the whole thing was staged as the dream of Renata, which sometimes became the dream of Ruprecht. So they were dreaming one another's dreams. Here you could say that Moses is dreaming Aron's dream and Aron is dreaming Moses' dream. And the people are in a permanent state of anabiosis. They're completely will-less. And that's why they're becoming such an easy instrument in both hands. In hands of Moses, who obviously we could say never violates his right of the prophet, but still makes him into some kind of a dictator. We often discussed during the production this famous, infamously famous short story, which is actually not that short at all, it's a novel, by Thomas Mann, The Law, Das Gesetz, which he wrote at the end of the Second World War. And although we all know that Mann was an anti-fascist and anything but an anti-Semite, by many people it has been interpreted as an anti-Semitic work, as a dirty work, as a very deeply troubled and problematic work. I've actually always enjoyed reading it. And I must say that I see a lot of connections between Mann's approach to Moses and the whole issue with prophets and Schoenberg's, with the only difference that Schoenberg was somehow identifying himself with Moses, deliberately or non-deliberately, but he felt himself. You know the story when he announced that he's stopping his work as a musician and becoming a Zionist and is dedicating his life to the salvation of the Jewish race and all this. And actually, in many ways, Schoenberg was a prophet because he prophesied the Holocaust. He prophesied Shoah many years before anybody thought of it. And he was right. You know, he had an absolutely, I think, I've never known him, but from what I've read of him and about him, he must have been an absolutely intolerable person with an intolerable character. But very often he was right. And that makes the whole approach to making Moses often ridiculous in this production, I think, an absolutely right approach. He is like a magician without the wand. He's known it all. He can do all of this magic, but he can't for whichever reason. And Aron, who is not even half, has not got even the half of the talent, he is a showman and he wins. So when Barrie and I started discussing this piece early on, and I should perhaps add that in our relationship, as in my opinion should be in a relationship between the director and the conductor in a Musiktheater world rather than in the operatic world, the discussions about the piece start years before the first rehearsal. I always find it deeply frustrating when director and conductor shake hands on the first day, and the conductor opens the score and says, now what we're going to do with this. And the singers are looking at one and then at the other one, and they don't know who are they going. Are they with the Moses or are they with the Aron? In our relationship, we meet long time before, and then we go pregnant. We both go pregnant with the piece. Eventually, in the rehearsal room, both of us arrive obviously fully prepared, but none of us knows exactly what's going to happen. So in this piece particularly, the musical shapes, the musical forms, the musical syntax often was the initial impulse for the staging. So in other words, I would say, Barrie, here there is a double fugue between the two choruses. And these contrapuntal lines need being underlined, being emphasized. Can you stage me this fugue, please? And then Barrie would say, okay, can you play it to me or sing it to me? And we would always start the rehearsals with half an hour of music, where Barrie would sit on his throne. At the Komische Oper, the director sits on the kind of a throne, which exists since the times of Walter Felsenstein, and would listen. And the chorus master and I, and sometimes soloists and I, we would perform what we have prepared in the rehearsal room. And then I would comment on it. I would sort of analyze it for Barrie. Not necessarily in all the musicological terms, but saying, this is important, these two lines are fighting each other. You just saw the little fragment of the chorus where the two choruses, it wouldn't have been possible had the chorus been standing facing downstage, facing the audience, how it often happens. So we needed this stereo effect, this antiphonal effect, and Barrie staged it. On the other hand, when I saw that Barrie was reinventing the Hollywood in this scene of the Golden Cult, that gave me a completely different idea of how to musically resolve the orgy. So I started to looking for Korngold and other film composers' effects in the score. And of course I found them because, as we all agreed, Schoenberg has had it, like all of these composers who were actively involved in the Weimar Republic music making, they all had it in them. We don't know who invented Hollywood. Was it Zemlinsky, or was it his pupil Korngold? Or maybe it was even Alban Berg, because some of the pages of Lulu, his last also unfinished opera, they remind you of this film noir of 1940s, and that was all beforehand. So to answer your question, David, it was a permanent game of mutual inspiration, which often required an incredible deal of patience on the side of the choristers and soloists, because we would always come with new ideas. But what was clear from the start, that we are going to explore the logic of a dream, so thinking of interpretation of dreams by Freud, and we're going to explore the Beckettian line, the theater of the absurd. So these two things were there from the start. And the third thing, which was clear for me, because I feel myself much more Stravinskian than a Schoenbergian, that I would do everything in my power to make this score sound like Stravinsky where I can, without violating it. So thank you for noticing it, Gundula. And actually, there is one quote by Stravinsky. There is a deliberate parodistic quote of the Sacre, of Rite of Spring, in one of the scenes of magic with Aron. I think it's the scene with the snake. I have it marked in my score. It is a bar taken from the Rite of Spring, And of course, it's a huge middle finger to Count Prince Igor from Count Arnold.
I think this could be a good moment now to show a little bit of the dance around the golden calf from the production from the Komische Oper Berlin. Let's have this brief, short excerpt of it. Yeah, this was a little bit abrupt, but anyway, I think this is one of, no one would say that this is non-theatrical music, I guess. And I guess this is one of those parts where Arnold Schoenberg is more disorganized, as Marianne Smart said, more disorganized than he always wanted to be. And we could see very well, in a very good way, the puppets used in this production. About 100 or more than 100 puppets were used, so they doubled the chorus. Those puppets, what association did they give to you as the audience, David, Gundula, Mary, and Smart?
I'll start because I think I might have the least to say. Gundula said some very interesting things yesterday about the puppets that I definitely want to invite her to elaborate on. But the puppets are scary. I mean, puppets are almost always scary. These puppets are really frightening. And it's because of the mass of people on stage, I think it's also hard to really understand what you're perceiving. Where do the puppets end? Where do the humans end and the puppets begin? What is the continuity in it different? And this might also give us an opportunity eventually to talk about the effect of watching this as a streamed production rather than in the theater, because it is, I think, easier to assimilate certain aspects of it. But the thing that I wanted to ask Gundula to talk about is really the costuming of the puppets and the historical setting that we get at this moment. There's a lot of 1930s street clothes in the costuming of the chorus throughout the performance. But I think it's at this moment when we start to see a wider range. Definitely the references to Orthodox Judaism, but that's not all of the puppets are meant to be sort of traditional Orthodox figures. The one that struck me when I was rewatching this clip earlier today is the one in a hoodie, who's obviously sort of from this moment, and I think also a child. And then there are the sort of tribal costumes, that traditional Middle Eastern dress, which I think are worn by both the puppets and members of the chorus. So trans-historical, so the production suddenly becomes trans-historical in a very interesting way at this moment, I guess I'd say.
I agree that the aspect of time here and historical chronology is very interesting. I actually think the choristers' costumes up to this point, to me at least, did not just suggest 1930s. It was also kind of more contemporary, right? Also across times, at least across the 20th century. But it is at this point that they're explicitly marked as Jews from all kinds of different areas, as you said, and different times. And so what I was thinking about, also in connection with the very end of the production, is whether here it's a projection where the choristers project the future of the chosen people and reject that future ultimately. They kind of act out, what will that future be? What will it be like? What will happen? And in the opera, in the score, Moses predicts that at some point and says they will get the everything that they need from their one God for all the persecutions they have to sustain over millennia. So the opera text itself projects forward from the presumed time of Moses through the Shoah and the 20th century. And so for me, this is a moment where the puppets enact that, where in this timeless settings, or at least if it's set in the late 1920s and the beginning of the sound film era, the costumes of the puppets project a variety of persecutions of Jews that are being persecuted. And so they're being enacted, but maybe also rejected at that time when they get dismembered, when they get thrown on the pile later in the orgy scene and dismembered. And they all end up on a pile, but the choristers are still heard singing in the background. And so I found that interesting as in the very, we also talked yesterday about the very ending of this production. So the production ends, I'm not sure we'll have time to show that clip. So maybe I'll just describe it, and many of you will have seen it. Moses comes down, or he emerges out of the pile of these puppets, of the dummies that have been left after the orgy. And he goes down, and then at the very end, he kind of climbs back up on the pile and he pulls up the rug. And at the very end sinks down into the rug or slides under the rug, which is actually a moment that to me brought up Beckett's Happy Days and the very end where Winnie is kind of absorbed in this pile. And we don't know that she will die, but it's kind of implied, or eventually she will have to. So here he slides down under this carpet on the pile of those bodies. But the very production begins with Moses rolling out of a carpet, presumably the same carpet. And so for me, that suggests the ending is very bleak and very, very thoughtful, starting with this use of the puppets. And yet there's also an element that to me suggests a potential cyclicity. Moses slides down under the rug at the end of Act 2. And there can't be in this production, I think Barrie Kosky makes a very clear suggestion, there can't be an Act 3. Moses is very, very intentional here about giving up and killing himself as the bearer of the law. And yet at the beginning of Act 1, he slides down from the carpet and rolls down. So potentially he's rolling down from this pile of bodies. The whole history starts again. And so going back to the puppets, to me, I was wondering whether that's a moment in which there's a split or a projection, just like the movie camera projects the whole orgy scene, a projection of what would it be like to be the chosen people? What would it be like to take on that identity that Moses wants them to lead into, seeing what comes of it in the future. So yeah, David.
These are super interesting thoughts from both Marianne and Gundula. Thanks so much. I just wanted to note one other thing that I found astonishing at this moment in the production, which is in every production of Moses and Aron that I've seen, the moment of the revelation of the golden calf is a moment in which figuration is reserved for the Aron position. What seems so astonishing about this moment is that the chorus participates in the moment of radical transfiguration and duplication. Right now here, rather than just the image, the graven image being out there, here each of the chorus members is implicated or participating or collaborating in this moment of conjuration. Of a kind of false figuration that is staged as a kind of extraordinary spectacle. And I found it utterly confounding. I mean, and I mean that in a great way. Like I was completely confounded when the chorus all of a sudden appeared with these body doubles. I agree with Marianne, I found them harrowing. But I must say, and you know, in the chat function, the first question that popped up in the chat was, what are we supposed to make of these puppets? And I have to say, beyond my disquiet, I just don't know. And I guess I find that fundamental sense of mystery in this piece to be a really wonderful and revelatory moment in the production.
Yeah, you would think that I know the answer because I asked Barrie Kosky, what do you mean? Well, what did you intend with these puppets? But I don't know. And I must admit, I never asked him because I didn't find it ever necessary to ask him. As David said, the mystery is the thing in these puppets, and the associations they give to each of us, and different associations they give to each other. For me, it's not that I don't find them that spooky as you. For me, it's more, I see in them also the souls of a people wandering through the desert, which can be a heavy weight on the backs of this people. A heavy weight you have to pull and push with you through the desert, and maybe sometimes leave behind you. I was reminded to another thing that's a completely different thing, but maybe you know the movie Up by Pixar, when the old man with the balloons, with his house bared by balloons, walks and wanders through a kind of desert and has to leave behind his old house because his wife died. So this was for me a kind of, these puppets are also the heavy weight of history, of the past, to leave behind you and to project things into it. So, and I think this is the way how Barrie Kosky's productions work and function for the audience, with images everyone gets, and everyone get different imaginations and different associations from these images on stage. I would say we are nearly at the end, but before we open our discussion to the audience, if someone wants to ask from outside something, we should briefly come to the point the point that popped up before. What does it mean to show this production now on a streaming, on two-dimensional, in a two-dimensional way? Streaming this production is coming from the idea of this piece that images impure the pure theory. Does this streaming, does this presentation of this production maybe spoil a little bit the intention of the director or of the conductor, because it's not the same seeing it on stage or seeing it on a screen? Maybe we start with Vladimir. What does it mean for you to listen to this recording now? And we have heard how your musical interpretation comes out of the scenic, the ideas, the theatrical ideas, and makes sense together with the theatrical ideas on stage. Is this the same still if you see it on a screen now as a recording, not in an evening performance, but now fixed in a recording?
You know, I'm a bit in two minds about the whole thing, because on one hand, I'm feeling deeply grateful that there is such a chance to see this production, which none of us was hoping to ever see again, because Barrie was very clear. He said 5 performances and that's it. And also, myself, I've only seen this production once from outside in the piano dress, the Klavierhauptprobe, where I left my assistant to do it and went out and watched it for the first time. But then, of course, so many things changed between the piano dress and the final dress that I'm seeing the whole thing for the first time. Just imagine how much can a person see being perched in the orchestra pit, and you know, all I was seeing was this hundreds and hundreds of feet, pairs of feet in front of me. Sometimes a very very exuberant dress or hair dress, but that was it. And of course, I saw the faces of my performers who I was cueing. But seeing it from up close and seeing it from a distance is a very different thing. So I am grateful. And also I find that because you're seeing, as Marianne, I think, said it, you're seeing and hearing things in a compressed way, it's much easier to digest it, especially for those who are watching or hearing this piece for the first time. On the other hand, I am definitely a person of an ear. You know, Joseph Brodsky in one of his essays remarked that the whole humanity can be divided in 2 parts: those who are driven by the eye and those who are driven by the ear. And then he developed the whole theory that the Greeks were driven by the eye and the Hebrews were driven by the ear, because of course you couldn't show the picture of God. That's clear. And my first experience with the music by Schoenberg, with this piece, was back in 1987 in Moscow, on an LP. Someone brought an LP recording of this piece. I can't remember which one it was. It might have been the one from the Eastern Germany with Herbert Kegel on the long play vinyl. And I remember the first 10 minutes, I was absolutely mesmerized by the sounds of the, you know, the burning bush, these voices emerging from an orchestra, just hearing it, imagining the cinema in my head, drew pictures. But of course, I didn't speak any German. So as soon as they started Sprechgesang, I switched off. I completely lost it. And of course, I wasn't following the score. And yet, those images coming, the pure sound streaming into my ears, actually, in one sense, it would be nice to be able to only hear the initial sounds of this opera and not to see anything at all, to do it in absolute darkness. That would be my next wish for next production of Moses and Aron. And then very, very slowly the sight returns. So having said that, I see there is a big danger in the general climate of the streaming culture, not because it would take us away from the theater. People would still go to the theater as soon as it becomes possible, but because people would take this half product which they are perceiving through the screens for what was originally intended. So we become Arons who are selling the people half truth, but in a very good wrapping. As I said, to view and listen Moses and Aron through the screen and the speakers of your laptop or even your system is much easier than doing it in the theater. But for me, it's only half a deal.
Any other remarks from the other participants? David?
Just very quickly, I really appreciate the points. I would only say I would rather take, you know, shiny wrapping or not, in a moment, and I say this, you know, I think I'm guessing we will all agree. You know, in the United States, at a moment where we are still, at least some of us, sheltering in place, and at a moment in which the stakes of being fundamentally manipulated by a charismatic leader. Like, I would much rather have the opportunity, since I can't go to the theater, to go to the theater through my screen. I hear you, Vladimir, I hear you, but I guess I feel like the contribution of this production and of the Frühlingsstürme yesterday and of the Orpheus tomorrow that we're discussing tomorrow, it is so important at this moment. So I guess I would say for this moment online and this piece online, I find it hugely helpful and stimulating and reassuring in its seriousness, in its inventiveness, and I guess in its contribution and the dialogue that it generates. So I would also just add that.
Gundula, up to you.
Very briefly, I totally agree. I think as being a video production, and I must confess I have not seen the original production. I did see a number of productions over the last years in the summers, but not this one. So I can't compare it. However, just watching it as it is on a stream, I think this is quite a successful video capturing, and that the staging itself lends itself quite well. In that we get a lot of shots of the entire stage. So there's rare moments where I was frustrated and I wanted to see something else and the camera turned away. Instead, I think the camera most often gave a wonderful, in fact, beautiful interpretation of these masses in a way that maybe enhanced the disturbingness of the puppets that I can imagine if I was in the theater further back, I might not have noticed all these details. I was very drawn in. Like David, I'm extremely grateful. I was kind of thinking about the exodus of this production from the Komische Oper at this time, where we are all sheltering in place and yet the products move and they're going to kind of into diaspora. And so I think even from that point of view, it's quite fitting for this production. And I know Marianne has some interesting thoughts. So Marianne, maybe.
Marianne, please.
Interesting or not, just one maybe perception that I think has been moved towards by the last couple of comments, but not actually named, which is that this is an incredibly apposite work for this moment. To me, it's the perfect opera to be viewing. It might have been even more perfect a month or two ago, because that was a moment at which I was deeply preoccupied by the question of abstraction and epistemological uncertainty. I think now we have a new epistemology, or a new set of conditions in which to make decisions about everyday actions. But in March and early April, I felt as if every single small movement of the day was based on thinking about something that couldn't be represented and really couldn't be understood in material form. And watching this opera over the last couple of days, I've just been thinking again about the problem of believing in something that you can't see and having to think about cause and effect and everyday decisions based on something that can't be represented or shouldn't be represented is just so illuminating for this moment. And I can't really capture it in words, but there's some deep resonance there for me.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you to all. So now, is there outside any question or remark someone would like to send us? You can raise your hand and we can hear your voice. Don't worry, we can't see you, or you can just write in the chat a question or remark. Any remarks there? Or maybe we answered everything. We answered all the questions. Well, then I would say thank you to everyone here in the room, in the Zoom space. And I would like to announce tomorrow's discussion at 3 p.m. Central European Summertime, which is 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time and 11 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, will be the last of our 3 Zoom symposiums called From Neustart ins World Wide Web, Claudio Monteverdi's / Elena Katz-Czernin's Orpheus, held in German with Bettina Brandl-Riesi, professor in theater studies at Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen-Nürnberg, composer Elena Katz-Czernin, that's the reason why I mentioned Australian Eastern Standard Time. For her, it will be 11 p.m., as I said. Clemens Riesi, professor in theater studies at Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen-Nürnberg, Juliane Vogel, professor in literature at the University of Konstanz, and it will be moderated by Rainer Simon, head of division of the Intendant at Komische Oper Berlin, Kosky. Thanks to everyone here, and thanks to the Schering Stiftung, which kindly supported these 3 symposiums. We started with Kurt Weill's Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagony, and we end with Johann Sebastian Bach, Die Kunst der Fuge, Contrapunctus 9. Thank you and good night.